Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Carlotta Vacchelli, and I am the Associate Editor of Simultanea, a journal of Italian media and pop culture, a relatively new but lively academic magazine that brings together many different scholarly perspectives and open discussions in any field related to media and popular culture in Italy. It is my honor to host in our program of video events an interview to Italian artist Luca Buvoli, who kindly accepted our invitation to answer our questions on his art, very much devoted to the investigation of pop imagery, especially comics. And he made his time available for us. Luca Buvoli is a multimedia artist whose museum solo shows include the Phillips Collection, Washington, D.C., the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the MIT List Center, Cambridge ICA in Philadelphia, and gallery solo shows at John Weber Gallery and Hyundai Gallery. Group shows included the Utopia Matters, Venice Biennale, Greater New York at PS1, MoMA, and the second Johannesburg Biennale, South Africa, while permanent public commissions are in New York, Houston, and soon in Seattle. His films and videos have been shown at the MoMA and Lincoln Center in New York, the ICA in Boston, and the British Library and ICA in London, and on Italian television, among other places. Articles on his works have appeared in the New York Times, Art in America, Modern Painters, Art on Paper, Phrase, The New Yorker, Flash Art, and others. So I will go straight ahead with my first question on the theme of comics and their relationship with pop culture in your art. So in your series of artworks, Not a Superhero, you focus on the representation of vulnerability through the dismantling of superhero comics imagery and their discourse. Characters, colors, bodies, captions, and balloons, pretextual features, narrative structures, etc. But you also include the objects connected to comics culture, such as the shape of the comic book and action figures. So what made you interested in these themes? Which aspects of superhero comics are central to your aesthetics, and what cultural and societal necessities does the myth of the superhero respond to?
Thank you, Carlotta. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for whoever will watch this interview. Well, that's many questions. I'll try to include answers to all of them. Well, first of all, I mean, I grew up reading comics, and from when I was a child in Italy, Il Corriere dei Piccoli to the Corriere dei Ragazzi, and then these were the magazines that my parents were bringing home, and then progressively, as a child and early teenage, the superheroes, which were beginning to be translated in 1970, I think was the first issue of Spider-Man, the Italian version, with a few years delay. And so mostly Marvel comics, but also DC comics too. So so I grew up in this imaginary, and the space of projection that the superhero provided, because in our culture, the Greek mythology could no longer connect to our need to represent the relationship with the outer, with stronger, more powerful beings. And so the superheroes definitely provide that element where a young child in their position of vulnerability and growth could imagine this developed character that fulfills a lot of the fantasies. So but in general, society does need a strong element of, so let's say, some role models. And the origin of the superhero, the American superhero, after the first wave, the gold age, or with Captain America and Superman, of course, it became, after the World War II, with the advent of the Cold War and the fear of a nuclear war, became a way to overcome the anxiety towards this atomic fear, the radiation, the nuclear impending war. You probably have seen all the footage of test and simulation of what could have happened if Russia had bombed the United States and so on. So in effect, the original origins of a lot of the superheroes included radiations as a catalyst factor. Spider-Man in the original version was bit by a radioactive spider. Daredevil was hit by the radioactive tank. The gamma ray, of course, transformed Bruce Banner into the Hulk, and so on. So, I remember, actually, there was a point as a child where I was dreaming of being hit by something radioactive that would transform me into superhero, having failed to figure out any other solutions and not be as wealthy as Tony Stark to become an Iron Man, a self-made superhero. So it was interesting. Little I know that decades later, after my advanced and aggressive cancer, radiations would have helped to save my life after the surgery. So interesting irony. So, but yes.
So in general, what you already partially replied actually to this question, but in general, what makes you interested in comics? Well,
the comic book format now, even the most elevated one, the graphic novel as it's labeled now, it is still a very accessible and universal vehicle of expression. And if you think, and it was even more, of course, in a pre-TikTok, pre-Instagram age, where, or even before, not only social media, but before the access to a personal computer, the main vehicle for expression communication, except for writing, was making drawing, making comics that every child could do, and was actually for many was an introduction to drawing, to art. So I began drawing by copying comics and making my own version. So, and I can show you now. So maybe, okay, let me pull them out. So these are from the age of 8, the age of 10, I did a series based on, well, this was the Supermark, was the character. These initially had different characters, had stories, had puzzles, anagrams, also very much like the comics we used to do. This was more like a childlike, but science fiction narratives, stories, and that I would be too embarrassed to read again, not only to you, but also to myself. And I was trying to find my first one. I have no idea where it ended. Well, anyway, I hope it comes out. My wallet. Here it is. I was doing this, starts to fall apart, on paper blocks that my father was bringing back from work. So this is in Supermark when I was 8, and followed by other stories with other characters. But then progressively became, this was when I was 9, I started to make them in really more elaborate comics, covered each by different color foil, even with silver, metal, aluminum foil inserts. and the list of all the characters, the enemies, and this is Supermark explaining the list of the powers and so on. So
it's very interesting because there is already a consciousness, an awareness of the different formats of the comics. There's the strip, there's all the paratexts. It's very interesting. Yeah.
So the others were let me show you. This one, that was the silver. This is the Sapphire Comics, again with the same protagonist and so on. And then the gold one, the ruby one, and so on. So that's how. But yes, definitely there was that aspect of accessibility. That was my communication tool. I, being introverted, I communicated through this. My brother and I were both interested in drawing, but he decided to go into the venue of music, sound, composing, and performing. But I stayed in the drawing field. But another aspect that interests me and kept my interest in comics is the relationship between visual and verbal language, which is something that at the time was almost like to add to the image itself. Sometimes, of course, at the beginning, the image could illustrate the text, but then progressively, it could be a way also to conflate visual and verbal language and to generate new meanings from their conflation. And later on, when I came to the United States for a master's degree, Master of Fine Arts degree. When I went back to the superhero thematic with my series, Not a Superhero, I tried to explore more the relationship between the verbal and the visual, but at the time, the language was no longer confined to the lines placed in order, in the regular order, left to right, but was actually floating around the page. Let me show you just one of the comics of Not a Superhero, which instead embodied this aesthetic of fragility. And so the words, not only the language was animated and often including aspects from fragments, quotes from philosophers, psychoanalysts, anthropologists, and so on, but also was moving around the page. And that was something that my exposure to visual arts in a broader sense, especially when I studied Academy of Fine Arts, and I had a great professor actually from Bologna, Sandro Sproccati, who introduced me to Mallarmé, to many of the concrete poetry. He was a poet too, actually. He's a poet. And but then I merged in that with the study on language by the modernist avant-gardes, from the futurists to the Russians, or even before maybe Art Deco. So that allowed me to explore verbal language in relationship to the visual, but a language that was no longer dedicated and devoted to rationality, which is very much like a long tradition of Western thinking that separates rationality and the mind from the body, the physicality. But instead, it was a language that became body again, became physical, that was not separated from it. And that has been, in a way, one of the focal and recurring elements of all my work, whether it's inspired, whether the series was inspired by comic books or whether we're independent from it. But so, and I think it still goes back to that powerful moment that the comics offered me as a child.
And you actually anticipated this question, but so what role in general does pop culture play in your art and in your societal reflections, as well as the way you observe individuals in contemporary times? And so what do you think pop culture has to offer to an artist?
Well, yes, that's a good question too. I we all live inundated by pop culture, etc. So unless one was really separated from the rest of the world, like Kaspar Hauser in the famous film, we absorb all the stimuli, and then as we go into adulthood, of course, we have to deal with the different ways in which our culture, our environment processes this thing, or relegates to childhood, to a regressive stage, or allows us to embody them. I grew up in the environment I grew up, which in the 70s in Italy. I could still read and trade comic books until my early teens. And even later on, when I began discovering like Alter Linus, Leternauta, heavy metal, Metal Urbain, and all these amazing French and Belgian schools of artists, it is something that was not at the time accepted by the official Academy of Fine Arts, where I ended up studying after the Liceo Scientifico, the high school for the arts. So, and actually, I wanted to say something because until I did the exams, the admission exams for the Accademia di Belle Arti, I had never studied art history. Our professor of drawing and art history at the Liceo was a great multimedia artist, actually, Tony Vedu, who unfortunately passed away also of cancer a few years ago. And he was making beautiful cartoons, watercolors, but he was also famous for performing with his band, l'Anonima Magnagatti, anonymous cat eaters, which is actually a stereotype for the people from Vicenza, my hometown. And he was performing in dialect, in the Vicentino dialect, which was also an attempt to bring back the local culture. And he's the one who encouraged me, not only existed as a model for multimediality, but also as a way to see that art could be serious, could be funny, could be a cartoon, and could be beautiful and at the same time funny. There were no juxtapositions. And so I really owe a lot to him, besides the fact that he was the one who told me about this Accademia Belle Arti when he saw my comics that I was doing on the side, from the technical drawings that we needed to do in a high school for the eye and the science. So but when I went to the Academy of Fine Arts after miraculously passing, I was suddenly exposed to modern and contemporary art. And I had to make my own comics on the side because the professor of painting, especially the main one, who was a very traditional painter who he was a restorer of frescoes like Tiepolo, Tintoretto, and had almost no knowledge of modern art. Thankfully, the assistant professor, Carlo Maschietto, to whom I owe also a lot, he introduced me to different forms of modern contemporary art, but still comics was something that I had to free myself from, almost like de-skill myself from this representational, in order to be able to have a looser sign, loose mark making. So the idea of de-skilling and freedom, it's an interesting one because at the same time, it's an apparent freedom, but it's also a form of repressing an important aspect of our culture, larger culture, which is the one of comic books. And I know that there were other centers like in Bologna, thanks to the dams, where comic book was integrated, was accepted as part of visual culture. And I know I've seen your interview with Frigidaire that I discovered later on. So there is the complexity of popular culture, but the Academy, and probably, and I know it was not only the Academy of Fine Venice, but many others, that you had to study painting. And so comics were something that a few friends of mine and I at the Academia were doing on the side. We even collaborated with on one. Actually, I brought some images to show you of no, first I want to yes, I need to show you as a step back. This is something I didn't really show, but to show how strong was after the Supermark series. I did, in collaboration with my brother, a series of comic books which were obviously copying, even tracing. I can recognize the parts were copied by Gene Colan, the parts that were drawings were copied from Jim Steranko. This is Jim Steranko, Captain America, and so on, but just changing and creating our own characters. So that was the power of our desire to make our own comics. But
beautiful. Thanks for sharing. It's great.
Yeah, let me show you. Here they are. Okay, here I made copies. The originals are in Italy. Copies of many of the comics I did. From this was one. No, actually, this was not the first one. The one this one I made actually when I was at the Liceo Scientifico, and when I was 16. This series, Venezia 2 ti aspetta, Venice 2 is waiting for you, all done with the rapidograph, which at the time was the only tool to draw India ink, because that's how you do it at high school for the science of the different points, the bits and so on. So I did this one, which actually, looking back now at it, was not bad. It had some interesting images and compositions and so on. And that's what encouraged my professor, Tony Ledoux, to lead me into that way. But here is a comic book I did in collaboration with maybe the first year of the Academy of Fine Arts, with two other classmates, first or second years, and Roberto Demetrio Nardi and Swami Navajato. And so we just divided the roles and so on, all done in pencil and so on. And then I had, but I was making my own existential comics, symbolic, well drawn with this, some of them even painted with gouache. One of actually, I'm so sorry that the main story, which was did in collaboration with a writer, a friend of mine, Riccardo Barbieri, was on a story with gnomes, gnomi, and different characters, entirely painted in color, gouache, beautiful, and I cannot find it. I think I must have lent it to someone, or and this person never returned it to me. Anyway, but so I kept moving on and so on to some that actually I noticed in some the study for the composition, the black and white. It's something that in the current Astrodoubt series, I went back to, even though here, of course, it was done on white paper. And so it's interesting, a series of unconscious flashback and some other more sci-fi. So with these images, so it was very prolific, but that was the not serious one. So even when I tried to experiment within the language of the comics with different composition forms outside the vignette, the traditional, the frames, it was done with a text which was legible and clear representations and so on. So, and that was, at the time, art was not the main, although I was studying and progressively becoming, I learned more about art. Comics was the main vehicle of, until I would say the third year of the Academy of Fine Arts.
But I would say that in general terms, your art places itself between lowbrow and highbrow culture, beyond placing pop references in the spaces reserved to institutional art, so museums and galleries. Your work cycles hybridize highbrow references such as Alexander Calder or Fausto Melotti or Arte Povera, with features of the superhero imagery and comics. So, for example, you rely on comics sequentiality, the interdependence between words and images, and the rendition of dynamism. And so it seems that you do not want to accentuate the distinction between these expressions, but rather propose a synthesis of them. And so what are the traits of continuity between lowbrow and highbrow culture? And do you believe that they play different roles in society, and in case, what roles?
This is complex to try to find a definition and a distinction, because as I told you, there was this change, the sudden immersion at a certain age when I was 18 into high art, but I couldn't escape from my previous tradition. And even when I was making, I forgot to say, when I began making art, painting, because I was still interested in certain language, the language I was addressing in my work was more was also influenced by artists like Cy Twombly, Paul Klee, Gastone Novelli, and then I discovered conceptual art, which was a great freedom language, which was often related to art, was related to language. Marcel Duchamp and the play on words and Marcel Duchamp open up. So it became much more complex than the relationship that could happen only on the page in the alternation of the bottle, but high and low. So if the only distinction I could see between the high and low brow of the comics, and I know there still persist these biases and this definition in many aspects, even in contemporary art, are defined by context, first of all. I mean, many of the amazing comic book artists who do fantastic works, visual and so on, but because they only publish and distribute in the comic industry, they are not accepted as real artists. There have been few exceptions, and well, Gary Painter shows in a gallery too, for example. And Chris Ware is one of the most interesting examples, because he went to the School of the Art Institute in Chicago with multimedia artists, and then he developed his work, which is in a form of a graphic novel, but is so much more complex and rich, and visually the complexity is so stunning. And his work was also shown in a gallery, was shown in a Whitney Biennial. I think he deserves to be seen as a major artist, and not just as in the comics, but somehow for a variety of reasons also beyond my knowledge of the system. Maybe it also has to do with his own approach to the snobbishness of the art world. In some of the comics, you see some of the jokes or irony he makes towards art school teaching. So I could understand how he must have suffered to continue his, very much like I did as a student, as an art student in a traditional environment. But one is context anyway, and the second one is awareness. So is it the awareness that makes the artist very much like an arte povera artist like Giuseppe Pennone, who comes from I understand from a family of farmers, but what the distinction of his work with nature, with the trees, and what some people do as part of rituals or habits is also starting from the awareness. So, but beyond that, I have to say that there is another aspect that I discovered. It became clear to me when for a project which I've never completed, but I would love to someday. I made a series of interviews to comic book artists from Marvel and DC, maybe 10, 15 years ago, after casually discovering during a fair around NYU, Neil Adams, who had been one of my idols, a fantastic artist who illustrated from X-Men and to Green Lantern and so on. And I saw it was there. I can't believe it. So I began becoming, anyway, interested. I interviewed him, interviewed Jim Starlin, interviewed Joe Kubert, whose early works I was copying. I still have a huge drawing. I'm not going to pull it out of a Tarzan copied from the amazing Joe Kubert that I participated in one of these competitions early on as a child. I won a prize. And who else I interviewed? Carmine Infantino. And what became clear to me interviewing them and asking them, Carmine Infantino, for example, it was famous to illustrate the Flash, the very early Flash, and which had all these contrails of motion. So I thought that he was aware of Italian futurism. But when I asked him, and I think it was very sincere, said, no, I never heard of them. Who are they? Is that Modigliani? So it was interesting. It was a matter of exposure to the knowledge, the high knowledge that I had on art, that I had when I went to the Academy of Fine Arts, but before I didn't. And because it was not part of a traditional curriculum. In the States, there is more focus on art education for children. They bring children to museums, but we went to some historical museums, of course, as a child. So and I noticed in speaking with them, it was also a matter of class because, I mean, Jim Starlin was in the military, and I think in the Korea War or something. And when he was in the military, he was drawing, making his comic books, was sending them to Marvel, being rejected and so on. So he comes from Detroit, which was drawing cars, drawing industrial parts. So that's what the concept of drawing. And so it was Joe Kubert was making his drawings with charcoal, with chalk on the sidewalks, and became this amazing study, but something that he developed and on his own, and that's what made me realize, yes, that that's one of the big major distinction. And suddenly now the main distinction is determined by the market. And it's odd how an artist whose work could be having an audience in the comic book industry and so on, but in the visual arts field is priced much higher, and suddenly it becomes a different form of authority and different class and so on. So it is a complex distinction, and exclusivity deals with exclusivity, the notion of popularity, and it goes also in both ways, because once an artist has reached a certain level of success, often would like to reach a larger audience. I mean, besides people like Jeff Koons, who tried initially cynically to mimic and to speak to every person, but people like Kaws, who went to the School of Visual Arts and illustration, and then progressively finds himself in a retrospective at the Brooklyn Museum. But there were still all the gadgets of all these characters he made by copying and just changing with the crossed eyes or the existing characters. Or, I mean, thinking of people like Robert Longo, who made Johnny Mnemonic, a film, Cindy Sherman, who also made her own film, and the most successful one, Julian Schnabel, who at the peak of success, he began becoming a film director. Actually, he became even more interesting as a film director. So there is the desire, but the possibility really of having both is extremely limited and rarefied. But it also, I have to say, it's a myth and a dream that I cultivate. And I've been, especially with Astrodoubt, I wanted to go back to a project that could speak to everyone, not just the art audience.
Well, Thank you very much for this answer. You actually already addressed this theme, but I would like to ask you about this ironic lens through which you observe the superhero comics in Not a Superhero, which is some way close to the way you approach futurism in Meta-futurism. And so what do you believe is the link between artistic avant-garde and mass culture? What common aspects do you investigate? Are you interested in a dialogue with artists that explore the links between this form, and could your art be seen also within this aesthetics perspective?
Yeah, this is an interesting point. Because before going to galleries and dropping off my slides, or that's how to show my art, my sculpture and so on, I went a couple of times to Milan, to Alter Linus, or to L'Eternato with my own portfolio of the comics that you saw reproduced before, to try to publish them. So my dream was to become a comic book artist. After I realized that I could not become a superhero. And so at least creating my own narrative and so on, I did not succeed in that, but I think there is still something of that dream of the possibility of making an art that was accessible. I have to say, over the many years, now I've been in New York. I came in 1988 for my master's degree, thanks to a Fulbright scholarship. So I developed also a few groups of work. Not a Superhero is the first one that gave me access to this hybrid language, and that was a comic book narrative. And there were people who recognized them and liked them because also they could rediscover something that in the art world, was a subject matter familiar to them, but without having to be clinically distanced from them very much like pop art did. And as a matter of fact, my accomplishments were when I was able to publish as a print in the printed form some of the stories of Not a Superheroes in black and white, and going back to the origin, and even creating my own page of letters from the readers, which was mimicked also in the font and size mimicking what happened in the Marvel and DC comics, especially in the original version in the American. In Italian translation, there were some, but so I did this one. Actually, the first one was this one with Galleria Loft. So I started with certain solo show. This was in Los Angeles, my first solo show in the United States and so on. But I realized that, is that feedback? Is that the feedback? I hear a sound. Is that the feedback? Maybe it is. Okay, it's interesting. It's something that Zoom does. But I made also flip books, which were also, when I began doing animated films, these were almost like excerpts from some of them. Start to flip them in reverse. But anyway, some of them color, the accordion style books, which actually had the narrative on one side, and on the back was maybe the making of. So my awareness of having studied art, having studied contemporary art, and then being immersed in one of the capitals, if not of production, but of exchange in art in New York since 1988, on one side made me go back to Gotham City, to the place where the superhero were inhabiting, and that so allowed me to trigger the sense of a narrative about confronting oneself with these larger figures of perfection, these superstars of the art world. But on the other, allowed me to think about pop art. I met Roy Lichtenstein. I met what can something like this be open to reach a larger audience. Some of the subsequent series, especially the flying method, I realized that maybe there was more a removal from, or better, there were some experimental aspects in my making, the multimedia, making that. Retrospective, I can think that was less animated by a desire to reach a large audience. But I still think there is a powerful drive and need to try to reconnect this split, which periodically happens in certain contexts, which is socio-economical and cultural. But you mentioned the futurism, and as you know, I mean, I could speak for another few hours only on that, because the Meta-futurist project is something that occupied me for about 10 years, and it was my response also to observing the demagogy, the populist drive, both in Italy at the time with Berlusconi, who named his own party with the most, of course, diffuse slogan ever heard in Italy, Forza Italia, go Italy, and Bush and George Bush, and so the rhetoric they brought to the Gulf War, and of course, noticing and seeing how the political and the artistic, the aesthetic became entwined, and it made me do much more thorough studies on not only on futurism, but how futurism was absorbed, or what was absorbed into fascism, and what of the futurist fascination with velocity, the myth of virility, and violence also was then incorporated into an ideological system that became the opposite of the freedom that Marinetti wanted to do. What we became instead repressive, violent, and became brought, of course, to, the alliance with the Nazi and so on. I mean, the later part, but that's it's something much longer that would be difficult to summarize in this work, in this conversation.
So we could, starting from your observations, we could address your themes, especially trauma, fragility, and vulnerability, and the way you represent them in the series Astrodoubt, which is a reflection on the pandemic and the collective trauma generated by COVID-19 and the pandemic. So on one side, it brings together many areas that you had explored earlier, such as superheroes, space, and futurism. And on the other, it connects with and it expresses the experience of forced meditation in which many of us found themselves during the lockdown. And so how was this cycle of works born, and how did the expression of this trauma take place?
Yes, this is a good point, because of course, COVID and took all of us unprepared, and there was nothing premeditated in this story of Astrodoubt, although I had been working on thematics related to outer space for about 11 years. In my flying project, that began with the beginners phase, guide how to teach how to fly without mechanical device. Then the meta-futurist, which would be the intermediate phase, which dealt with flight associated with fear and control, suddenly after 9/11, and what happened with the airplanes there, and our sense of constantly being controlled at any airport. And then the third phase, the advanced, had brought me to research and thankfully being put in contact with NASA scientists who allowed me to use some of the equipment they used to train astronauts for their outer space and gravitylessness in general. So at a certain point, about 2 or 3 years ago, I wanted to name the whole series Astrodoubt, because I was approaching this space age myth, but also with a certain distance, aware that the space age was almost the other side of the Cold War facet. So the exploration towards the other world was also something that was promoting and encouraging a military industry to produce something else. So the complexity of this work and going back to the roots of the space age put me in contact with a researcher with the National Air and Space Museum. I was thankfully I got a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship for 1 year there, so I could research in their archives. And a lot of the images, actually, especially of the first phases, the first very drawings of Astrodoubt were not a narrative story, were images that in which I was revisiting ads, advertising found in magazines like Missiles and Rockets, but specialized military magazines, which had this more abruptly the rhetoric of the gesture, the rocket going to skies if it was free now, and so almost pseudo-religious imagery that in order to, again, to reassure us of the good intentions of this exploration, industrial exploration. So but in the moment when the pandemic hit, suddenly there were, well, 2 of the works of this longer space, which I ended up instead encouraged by a friend, Mark Harris, who actually, who was also I need to thank because he helped me to edit some of the language of the Astrodoubt series. The name was the series was named Space Doubt, which in English, if you pronounce it, sounds like spaced out, to be spaced out, being like under hallucinogenics or something like that. And 2 of the works of these 180 works, which I conceived as part of this fictional residency on the International Space Station, one had to deal with the quarantine of the astronauts coming back from the Apollo 11, the first moon landing, and they had to stay in this isolated tank, imagining that maybe they could have got some extraterrestrial parasites or something. And the other work was trying to address radiations, my own radiation that I did for my cancer, as with humor, with dark humor, black humor, because, and it's so difficult to laugh at illness and cancer. And even when I go online trying to find them, actually, oddly enough, I find them more in Italian websites than in English. In English, there is a stronger level of repression of those, but some of them are still very chilling and hurting. I mean, but I wanted to do this project. So, and actually, when the pandemic hit, I was already beginning to develop this particular aspect with some of the relics I left from the radiation. So, the pandemic, radiation, my own sense also of extreme vulnerability, having my immune system being compromised by cancer, therefore brought me to be even more careful in facing the COVID crisis. And but in general, 2 of my friends or supporters, Don Clements, an artist who I went to school with here in the United States, died of cancer a couple of years earlier. Okwien Wezor, a curator who put me in the Johannesburg Biennale, died. So I was extremely sensitized. So, but the vulnerability is something that also has to do with, I think, one's upbringing. I mean, I without having to transform this into a psychoanalytical session, but I I mean, I grew up as a middle child with an older brother, more bullying me and so on. So also coming to the United States, being somehow lost and being at the bottom in a way, through anything, one of the philosophical and theoretical sources that allowed me to develop this narrative of not a superhero the moment I decided was also the dialectic of the master and the slave, going back to Hegel, and that then developed by Marx, of course. So the idea of being at the bottom of the ladder and therefore paradoxically having the power, because the slave is the one who can risk their own life, but the master cannot. So and being there, the struggling artist with one other 100,000 struggling artists living a few blocks away in an overpopulated artistic city like New York, made me also reflect and find cultural affinities. Also, another philosophers, post-structuralist philosophers, who try to again dismantle the master narrative and so on. So a lot of the language of the early Not a Superhero was based on deconstructive post-structuralist theories and language. The Astrodoubt, when I tried to remove myself from that intellectual language, I wanted to really to be accessible to everyone. Maybe it comes out in a more tangential way, and I could give maybe some example in some cases. There is one episode actually, I forgot the number, I think matter of, forgot, but in which Astrodoubt questions their identity. There, because of course the gender is never defined, he, she, or they. What is Astrodoubt? Is they a piece of paper on which white ink is formed? Is there an algorithm that on Instagram promotes itself, and is that the result of our need for escape with entertainment in this moment of tension? Is it the cost of the material? Is the material so on? So actually one of the episodes that I find most interesting, but of course maybe less traditional in the lineage of the comic book. So, but the vulnerability had already become in my own life, nurtured by finding my spiritual peers. In Italian, of course, we had Italo Calvino, who spoke about the leggerezza, the lightness, and somehow that was strongly influenced the Lezioni Americane, the lessons for the new millennium. So, but this is the way also which Astrodoubt started was not as an art project. It was informed by my two projects for Spaced Out, as I mentioned, the quarantine and the radiation. But it was, I made a series of drawings. I emailed it to a couple of friends, actually other two friends I have to mention, Oliver Carlin and Hemmindy Nelson, who were the most supporters. And Hemmindy is not in the art. Oliver is a writer, and his mother was a prominent curator and a supporter of the arts. But when they saw it, and I asked them, but do you think that someone else beyond the arts could be interested? I mean, we were stuck I was stuck in my studio. I just came back actually from India from 1 month, thankfully just in time before the airports closed. And I did not, my studio visits were canceled, but in any case, after my cancer, I had suffered a lot of isolation. It was difficult to re-enter and have a dialogue with art world. I had a big hiatus in terms of shows and so on, with few exceptions. So I found myself, okay, let's go back to the roots. I go back to comic books. Let's try Instagram. I've never done social media before. My daughter, who is now 16, but 2 years ago, so 14, she taught me. She just made an account. I learned how to learn some aspects. I'm still learning about Instagram. And I found that in the closureness of this world, that's what allowed a vehicle to reach whoever. And in matter of fact, I sent the link, the announcement of this project to my former classmates, to my family. And I started to form a following. Then, and some former students came, and artists found out. So it became a much larger discourse. But in some of the series were done absolutely with some of the episodes with the awareness that this could become art. The purpose was to try to make a drawing, post something every day. And as a matter of fact, maybe I forgot for 2-3 months, I posted everything, sometimes not only a drawing, but sometimes even an episode every day. I was also on sabbatical from teaching, so I could enjoy the luxury of detach myself from the administrative and teaching tasks. And progressively from the stories, which were initially only line drawings, then I started to introduce some collage, I tried to experiment with some effects, spatial effects that in a way condensed my study in outer space, but in this form. And then I had this other mini series inside Astrodoubt itself, which was like the safety messages, ironizing again on the constraints we were living in. The Olympics, when the Olympics were canceled, I made a series, the 2001, the COVID Olympics, imagining that the Olympics were actually taking place, but under the constraints. So the new weapons, the new tasks were modeling themselves to the life we were doing. And now I've been working for the past few months on more elaborate paintings, gouaches that take more than I couldn't do one a day in any case, and that address a brief history of time under COVID in 7 lessons, which is of course a homage to Stephen Hawking, A Brief History of Time, but also to Carlo Rovelli, the 7 lessons in physics, and other books, The Order of Time, that he is a great physicist who was able to open up complex language on quantum theory to a large audience, which is, and again, a very admirable task. But yes, so in a way, vulnerability and accessibility all became entwined.
Mm-hmm. So this is how you were encouraged to disseminate Astrodoubt through Instagram. And so I guess that social networks do represent for you some cultural relevance.
Well, it's interesting because for many years I'd resisted the pressure of social media, because I could see, especially in young people, the detrimental effects of the dependency on the immediate response. So that one person is worth it by the number of likes they get, or the number or whatever thumbs up and so on. And I could see, I meet younger people, students who were really affected, sometimes devastated by some negative response. And also what really puzzled me was the anonymity of social media, and how some people could really, behind this pseudonym, could trash other person in a way they would not do directly with the responsibility of giving their names. I felt it was very cowardly and very, very, very irresponsible, of course, attitude. And I could see that in certain environments, in certain repressive environments, and regimes, this could have been the only way to escape the control of the media. And but at the same time, the psychological effect of media is, well, we all know, so I'm not, but what I had experienced in first person during these forced restrictions under COVID, suddenly lacking a social contact, lacking the possibility of interacting physically with space, which I would encourage any child, any teenage to do over just the limitation of interacting with a screen or with another form of imaginary, which could be affected by algorithm and what sources one can find. And we found that was became our safety became, and our life became more and more embedded with the digital life we're living. And so so for me, the social media became a vehicle for distribution of this project, because the work was not done for Instagram. The works is existing still as work on paper. All the drawings are made on paper and with ink. And even though I utilized some of the technology like Photoshop, or even the first images, I was just pushing the contrast. And progressively now, I'm compositing them in order to make animations out of them. But the network, the social media, was something that I accepted as the only vehicle to not only to communicate with the outside world, but also to communicate with outside the art world. It was my attempt to escape the restriction, the biases of this world that somehow I had been lucky to get in initially, and having certain success with my works purchased by the Museum of Modern Art, the Guggenheim, showing at the Venice Biennale and so on. But so suddenly after the cancer, I have this detachment, and so how do I get back in? So I said, okay, do I have to get back in? Why don't I try to explore what was really the origin of my motivation for drawing? And I have to say, another aspect of this, I forgot to mention this, that when already in the early 2000s, when I had already done my whole series of 13 episodes of Not a Superhero, with all these collage, the comics and so on, which I and the animated films, which I began doing in '93 before knowing of any artist working with them. I found out later that Jonathan Borowski had made a very simple loop, but there were, and then later on a curator told me about Robert Breyer, who was doing both sculptures and animations. I did not discover his work until maybe the late 90s. I wanted to go, I knew that, yes, Not a Superhero is supposed to be about popular culture, is a way of revisiting from the point of view of the shy child that I was, and transforming the language of high art culture, because I was showing them in galleries, prestigious galleries like John Weber Gallery. I had 3 solo shows there, an art gallery which showed some of the major artists from Robert Smithson, to introduce a lot of the arte povera artists, minimalists and so on. They had their first show in New York in their gallery. So I was aware, and actually I'm even shocked that he accepted my language, vernacular language, and even showed animation, or accepted to show animation, because that part I wasn't very supported by. But also had to do with his wife at the time, Joyce, who wasn't supportive and of this, or better, was puzzling how their customers could be interested in a comic book inspired narrative and buying Dan Flavin or a minimalist work. So and I owe him a lot, by the way, too, because without the support, maybe my work could have never had a relevance for museums. I could have never encountered Robert Storr, who became most important supportive curator, one of the most important curators, who bought the work from MoMA and put me in the Venice Biennale. But I was aware that the language, and both the visual language of this fragmentary being and the posters, the drawings, the animated, they were not for a comic book audience. I had tried once through a friend, a former professor at Mayer, who introduced me to an agent, and but it was too experimental, of course. It was something they could not. So I applied for a grant from Creative Capital. I was lucky to have to access their strategic planning seminar and meet a wonderful person like Colleen Keegan, who became my mentor in this attempt to translate not a superhero to a large audience, to create a series of mini episodes for television, for maybe nighttime television, Adult Swim or Cartoon Network, I mean, whatever. So it was, of course, required a lot of work, but I was really serious because I devoted 2 years of my life in 2004, 2006 to this translation. And I took screenwriting classes. I studied the industry, the comic book, the animation industry, mostly the animation industry. So how it works, the cost of an episode, how does it get produced. I began showing, and I made a pilot also, a pilot for a series of 20 minutes episode. They call half hour, but they're actually 22 minutes. I wrote the script and I made a 2 minutes pilot with this revisited character. I posted a trademark and everything. So, and I was beginning to have meetings. I had a meeting with one of the executives of the Cartoon Network. And I was so excited, and I couldn't care less about art at the time anymore. I wanted to reach the real thing. And then I was invited to a group show at the ICA, and one of the curators or the juror was Christine Poggi, who was an expert on futurism, saw my work, the work I was doing until before this attempt, and you said, well, this is a great work. We should give him a solo show. So I had a solo show at the ICA in Philadelphia. I changed. I went back to sculpture material, fiberglass. I began interviewing people on some of the not only the scholars of futurism, and like Enrico Crispolti, Claudia Salaris, and American ones like besides Christine Poggi, Emily Braun, Jeffrey Schnapp, and so on. So I was beginning to, I shifted again into this meta-futurist future, and then meta-futurist tried to revise, and I abandoned that project. I still feel that I would like to go back to it. And I realize now from distance how difficult and how complicated it is, because I mean, the cost of producing a TV episode has changed a lot. In the meantime, MySpace became, and then YouTube. So suddenly the TV industry was no longer the only dominant discourse to present animation. It's possible to do it on your own. It's suddenly, and then of course Instagram, and so the possibility of visually communicating to a larger audience are much more spread. I'm still learning, and the night when I posted the first drawing of Astrodoubt, and I had no knowledge, but I was hearing of all these things, the viral phenomenon that sometimes people just put one image on and it becomes viral, and suddenly one wakes up and has 30,000 followers from nothing. And that was my dream that morning. The following morning, I woke up and looked up. Wow, I had one follower. Probably my daughter. So that was an interesting lesson in the system and what it takes also to dialogue with the digital, with social media. But I'm very excited about the fact that both the publishing industry and the entertainment industry, the Hollywood and major TV channels, which were the only vehicle to dominate the discourse of media, have been suddenly put under major challenges by independent individuals who, with their creativity, their efforts, they can provide alternative voices. It's a fascinating world. Well, that's what comics and fanzines used to do at the time. Only black and white copies, Xerox copy to distribute around. Now it's such a broad universe, which then inspires the major media too.
And we'll go back later on the techniques and what made you interested in some of the techniques that you are currently using or that you have used in the past, such as animation. But I would like to ask you a little more about the way your works address the representation of the fragility and the vulnerability of human beings. For example, through parody or other techniques of disempowerment, your works reveal and question the mechanisms and the structures that lay beneath narrations of strength, violence, masculinity. And these processes regard both the image and the world, which you often bring together in your work. And so, for example, the use of pale colors as opposed to the bright ones of the superhero comics, the fact that you choose an intentionally uncertain and trembling lettering, the destruction of certain geometric compositions that characterize the futurist imagery and graphics. And for instance, also in Velocity Zero, Marinetti's bombastic speech is weakened, and it is shown in its and accentuated in its fallacity, but its historical sense and the cultural relevance of the speech are increased. And so how did you get to elaborate these themes? Is your aesthetics directed to the revelation of truths that are somehow silent in the institutional discourse? And do recurring elements of your imagery, such as masks, costumes, armors, move towards this direction? And do you think that your art's role or art's role in general is that of familiarizing the public with the weaknesses and limits of our times, and also accepting their own limits and vulnerability? And so in the end, what languages should art discuss and dismantle today?
Carlotta, thank you very much. It looks like you have done not only a very thorough study of my own work, but also very insightful comments capturing the essence of the many projects, and also the continuity between my works from, I would say, I mean, you did not know my work from the time I was a student, but even maybe from my comics, teenage comics to of course, not a superhero, Meta-futurism. Yes, this aspect of vulnerability, fragility, which again, as I brought up before, has some roots in my life, my culture, but is something that I find myself particularly inclined to try to embrace and speak about, because in the larger scope in our society, we still tend to be enamored and by role models which represent only strength, authority, firmness, solidity, and models which are also or the perfect beauty, and not only these models have a detrimental effect on some of us. I mean, as we know, most girls who read women who read women magazine, girls who look on Instagram, they feel worse about themselves after looking at that, because the models of perfection that are provided are inadequate with our life, and therefore you could see that the space of projection that the superhero provided for a child vulnerability, every person vulnerability. At the same time, what about accepting and trying to do something out of our vulnerability, our fragility, instead of only aiming at becoming the macho, violent, aggressive person? This is another constraint that growing up in a macho culture like Italy, you have been a male, you have to be heterosexual and act in a certain way with women, which is absurd. But the pressure of peers and all this, if I remember as a teen, the things which thankfully now in these years are much more strongly put in question, and even more in the United States than in Italy, I have to say, but maybe in France and so on. The Me Too movement, this is actually the result of certain cult of masculinity that is so negative, and so allows, also prevents in this sense men from being in contact with their broader sense of humanity, which showing of course their femininity and so on, and vice versa. For women have to push and try to chase and follow certain stereotypes of beauty and so on, which of course, plus not to mention the fact that the culture I grew up with was very homophobic. There was no talk of transgender because it happened only in the movies. I mean, or there were one or two characters, Amanda Lear, I remember, the people who represented this possibility of transition. And instead, this transition is a transition that I feel is so important, so lively, life as a flow, changing from one state into the other one instead of being firm position. And that's why also in my colors, as you pointed out, the colors are never the primary color, the red and yellow and blue. They are colors that shift from one to the other one. I use turquoise, which is between the green and the blue, crimson between the red and the blue, and so on. And all these shades, the transition that make life richer. The reason why I also used at the beginning of Astrodoubt the black and white was also to make a comment on the dichotomy of life. We lived not only in the United States in this very polarized environment under Trump, which really brought up this ideological divide and to an absurdity. So the simplification of values, only black or white, you had to choose one side. Gray was not allowed. It was so restricting and limiting, and I felt, well, we have to do something. So I knew when I began the black and white, I already had in my mind, if I continue with that, I want that to be progressive, an arc, slightly introducing the gray, and then at the end of the arc will be color, full color. But I did not know how, when, how long would the pandemic. So I kept stretching the color. Then the first episode I did for the Phillips collection allowed me to delve into the colors of the classical paintings. And the first color drawing I made, I don't have it here. No. Yes, I do have it. Hold on a second. The first color in Astrodoubt was this. I don't know if you can see. Now it's framed, so reflection, but it actually was done when the Supreme Court approved. So it's Astrodoubt flowing in these rainbow waves when the Supreme Court allowed, of course, rights to couples share. Anyway, so a major milestone, but there is so much to be done. So yes, it's vulnerability because it's what allows us to also to understand and to go beyond this ideological split, which brings up also a lot of violence and damages people who psychologically are not prepared to address, and they found themselves in this confusing state that they have to decide when one or the other when they are not in either. And and I know that this happens in other countries. And it's a universe. So being in contact with our vulnerable self, I find this is the way also to get out of this pandemic, and hopefully we'll have a broader sense of the possibilities that we have.
Regarding the techniques and the genres and materials that you employ in your work, by maintaining a figurative orientation and directing your style towards a recognizable image, in your path you explore disparate genres, experimented with techniques that are always different, from sculptures made with garbage or of industrial material, to cartoon animation, to artist's book. So how did you get to express yourself through these materials and ways? What do these choices respond to, and what makes you interested in the medium of animation? Are there specific animations also that inspired or interested you?
Yes, no, good point. I would say that in the beginning, it was the line, the drawing. It's still at the base of everything. The drawing, I grew up loving and learning and trusting. And the sculptures I make, many people notice they are three-dimensional drawings. They are not sculptures that speak of a solidity. Except when in the meta-futurist work, when the topic I had to address flight, but with heaviness, I forced myself to make sculptures which also evoke a sense of mass and heaviness, but with irony. As a matter of fact, the piece that I had in the Venice Biennale, there was also a large sign spelling, well, un bellissimo dopodomani, a very beautiful day after tomorrow. And tomorrow, the 5 large fiberglass sculptures have in the middle the M of tomorrow is instead made of concrete, and it's fallen down on the floor, almost if the M of Marinetti or Mussolini, suddenly affected by giantism, was collapsing under its own weight. So some people caught these references. So the heaviness was as a way to address it, in a way to juxtapose. And one of the techniques, the strategies I utilized visually to weaken or to transform that heroic dream into by showing its opposite, by showing its collapse. But in general, yes, line is the line of the sculptures. Animation, of course, was drawn animation. I collaborated for some scenes in some of the animated films after 2004 with one of my assistants, Napoleon Nickdow, did some 3D modeling. I did not do myself a 3D model. I guide him, I tell him, and I follow. We do the animation together. I direct him. But all the rest is all hand-drawn. And even if I utilized maybe some compositing tools, but even sometimes even drawn digitally with a tablet. But most ultimately was the idea was, well, before I began the Not a Superhero, I was already attempting to make drawing into space. That's when I came to the States. I saw the work of Richard Tuttle, saw the work of Alexander Calder, as you mentioned before. I remember the work of Fausto Melotti that you pointed out. But I wasn't a sculptor, but I ended up in a sculptural department or access. I was able to learn how to address that. And but then when I became Not a Superhero, I had to mimic from the point of view of the fan, the child, the same multimedia universe that Marvel DC had. So I had to make action figures. So my own character, my own visitation of Spider-Man and Daredevil and so on was done, showing them in their fragile collapsing nature. And I mean, here I could go on and show, well, I just show images quickly of some of them because, well, even the Not a Superhero sign was made of plastic tubing, garbage bags found in the streets. And it's also ironic because at the time, looking back, I was working as an artist assistant for Keith Saunier, a post-minimalist artist who was known mostly for his neon sculpture. So, but these do not turn out. So in a way, it was also my attempt to revisit the language of science, of the bright colors into this vulnerable, said, okay, at the bottom of the ledger, who makes the work, the assistant and so on. So not that, I mean, but I helped, of course, and I contributed. And the action figures, this is a catalog I designed for one of the show in Houston, but like the first of the Incredible Hulk or the Human Torch, the Thing from the Fantastic Four and so on. So they were all made of wire and definitely showing the vulnerability. So sculpture, action figures, action play sets, animated films and drawn, and flip books. What else did I do? Well, yes, whatever. And then, so it's something that pushed me. I never made an artist book before. I made comic books, but they were never seen as artist books. But then people encouraged me, okay, since so actually the sculptures that came before the comic book, the narrative, before there were a series of drawings, but then became episodes as such. And so when I went back to Astrodoubt, I in a way I did the same. I had the drawings which existed on Instagram, but then I had the action figures, my they're on the other side of the studio, the cast, which I had made actually for the Spaced Out series, but they became the protagonist of the episode Welcome to COVIDville, which is entirely shot in almost live action, almost no drawings there, except at the end. So it's the escape from the 2D, the flatness, the two-dimensionality of the world we're living in, into the 3D that's supposed to offer this escape freedom.
And so I will conclude my interview with maybe a little more personal question. Your compositions and figurations, as well as your clear cultural references, seem to point to the sky, space, to air, to hate. And this makes me think of a spiritual impulse or an ether pantheism. So what do you seek in the sky? What do you seek in this dimension?
Yes, you're right in saying that also it's a more personal question, because it may go back to the fact that my father was a pilot in World War II and was in the Air Force. So I grew up in rooms which were decorated with posters of the Frecce Tricolore, the Italian aerobatic team. And I used to go to aerobatic shows to look at the color contrails in the sky, which of course I then saw again in the contrail of Captain Marvel and many other superheroes later on. So the fact also that I was a competitive runner, the idea of flowing and running through, but before then I was a competitive swimmer, and swimming is very much like flying. Defying gravity is part of my vissuto, my lived experience. But also it's interesting, the essay that in the first essay of the first published issue of Not a Superhero was an essay by Marco Colapietro, now called, now named Tommaso Pincio, as you all know. And the essay brings back and explores the origin of the superheroes, also in relating it to maybe the Catholic and the Christian imaginary. So growing up in a very Catholic environment, in a very Catholic city like Vicenza, going into churches, you see all these saints, floating angels and so on. So Tiepolo, Tintoretto, later on, when you start learning something about art, are the somehow represent inhabiting the same space of the superheroes. So yes, it's a combination of that, the popular imaginary I absorbed, going back to the religious imaginary, and filtered through maybe my familiar, my family representation and experience with actual flights.
So thank you very much. We can conclude our interview. Thank you very much for your availability and all the observations and your answers. I look forward to broadcasting them through Simultanea. Grazie.
Thank you very much, Carlotta. Thank you very much to Simultanea, and thank you for all of you who watched this interview. Okay, and follow Astrodoubt _. Okay, bye-bye.